Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on Chapter 5, Listening. Do you know why God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth? So we can listen twice as much as we talk. Okay, I'm not going to quit my day job. But in all seriousness, folks, we do talk too much, and we need to listen more. And that's what today's lecture is about. How vital and how important listening is to you, a college student here at Georgia Highlands College. So let's talk about the importance of listening. There are so many incredible benefits to improving your listening habits. The first is that people with good listening skills are more likely to be hired and promoted than people with lower listening skills. In addition, listening is a good leadership skill to have. People listen to leaders that know what they're talking about and that listen to others. Good listeners are also not easily fooled. They can cut through the BS. They're astute, they're intelligent, and they're discerning. So being a good listener has its advantages. Asking for and listening to advice actually makes you look really good. So try and do it more. You'd be surprised at the result. Listening also makes you a better friend and a better romantic partner. Let's face it, do you want to date someone who's not a good listener? I know I wouldn't. So listening has all the potential benefits for you, and becoming a better listener will increase your productivity in so many areas of your life, personally, academically, professionally. It's a win-win-win. So let's talk about how important listening is and how you can become a better listener. But first, let's talk about some misconceptions about listening. The first myth is that listening and hearing are the same thing. Let me explain to you the difference between listening and hearing. Listening is when, let me back up. Hearing is when sound waves strike the eardrums and the ears transmit these messages to the brain, okay? Everyone can hear unless they have a hearing deficiency. All right, listening, completely different. Listening is when the brain reconstructs these impulses and attaches meaning to them, okay? So hearing is one thing. Listening means comprehending, understanding, and attaching meaning. Now, the second myth about listening is that it's a natural process. It's anything but natural. Let me tell you, listening is hard work. And I don't have to tell you, you're a student. I would say that you are a professional listener. Maybe not so much, but would you not agree with me that listening is your number one skill as a college student? It's one of the most important things that you do is listen to your professor lecture. So I'm here to tell you, let's work on your listening. Let's become a better listener because it's going to help you in your academics. And let's face it, I know you would be very happy to get straight A's, right? No complaints from you. All right, the last myth is that all listeners receive the same message. That is not true because perception is skewed. We're not going to see the same picture or hear the same sentence and interpret it the same. So just because something is said doesn't mean it's being received in the same way by all the recipients of the message. So there are some misconceptions about listening. Now let's talk about the stages of the listening process. So the first is hearing. Now hearing means that you attend to a signal or a sound. Something grabs your attention and you hear something. A signal, a sound, a voice, someone speaking, someone singing. And that's the first stage in listening is hearing. The next stage is understanding. Understanding is making sense of the message, okay? The next step of listening is remembering, and it's actually the hardest part of the entire process because you actually only remember 50% of what you hear immediately after you hear it. So let me repeat that for the half of you that didn't get that the first time. Studies show that people only remember 50% of what they hear immediately after they hear it. And if you don't believe me, how many times have you met someone at a party or a social situation, they tell you their name, and within 30 seconds, you couldn't remember their name to save your life? Happens all the time. The fourth step in the listening process is to interpret. And interpreting is considering the sender's nonverbal behavior, the situation, and other cues that will help you understand and put together and interpret what that person is saying to you. The fifth part of the listening process is evaluating. So it's making a judgment on what the person is saying. And that's especially important if you're evaluating a persuasive message. And then the final stage in the listening process, the sixth stage, is responding. And as you know, feedback is the vital element in the transactional communication model. Feedback is giving responding is giving observable feedback, whether it be verbal, nonverbal, or both. So again, to recap the stages of the listening process, you've got hearing, which is attending to a sound, understanding, making sense of the message, remembering, which is retaining the information. Number 4, interpreting, which is considering nonverbal cues and other cues of the sender. The 5th component is evaluating the message. And the 6th component of listening is responding to the message. Okay, so let's talk about common distractions in listening, because let's face it, we are a very distracted society. Are we or are we not? Your cell phone and technology is a huge factor in that. But the first distraction of listening is message overload, or TMI. We are constantly bombarded every single day with news updates, status updates, tweets, everything else. How do we know what's important? How do we know what we need to remember? It's a little bit overwhelming. So we're bombarded with all this information and we're not quite sure how to process it. Another distraction for listening is rapid thought, or what I like to call mental spare time. Let me explain. A normal person speaks between 100 and 140 words per minute, but our brain is capable of understanding speech rates at up to 600 words per minute. Whoa, that means our brain is a highly sophisticated piece of equipment that's being extremely underutilized. So what's happening while we're listening to someone speak? I'll tell you. You're making your shopping list, you're planning out what movies you're going to watch on Netflix, you're making plans for the weekend. You're not listening to the person in front of you, and you're not fully being mindful and truly paying attention to what they're saying. Psychological noise is a very big distraction in listening, and we talked about that in Chapter 1. Noise is anything that prevents the receiver from understanding the message as being sent from the sender. So psychological noise is that noise inside your head. It's the noise, the things that are weighing on your brain that you're constantly thinking about, that is keeping you up at night, that bills, money, romantic problems, whatever it is, we all have psychological noise, and it's very dangerous. Physical noise can also be a factor if there are other conversations around you, or a TV in the background, or any other noise. It's going to prevent you from being able to fully attend and listen. I remember when I was younger and my parents would take our family out to dinner, my mom would always insist that we eat in a quiet restaurant, or we stay away from the kitchen or the bathrooms. And I would always say, why do you care so much? Let's first available. I want to eat. But now that I'm older, I completely understand and respect where my mother came from, because if I'm going out to enjoy a meal and pay money to eat out, I want it to be as an enjoyable experience as possible. And if I'm in a noisy place, it's going to diminish the overall quality of the experience. And if any of you have been in a noisy bar or any kind of noisy place, it's not enjoyable to scream your conversations because you can't hear the person that's sitting right in front of you. Cultural differences also are a distraction. If someone has an accent, or if someone doesn't speak English as a first language, it could be extremely challenging to fully listen and pay attention and understand what the person is saying if there's a cultural difference between you and that person. So those are 5 common distractions of listening. We talked about message overload. We talked about rapid thought, the fact that our brain can process much faster than we speak. Psychological noise, the noise inside our head. Physical noise, the noise in our environment, and cultural differences between the speaker and the receiver. Now, let's talk again about social media, because that is a very big distraction that prevents us from fully listening and fully being present. It just seems that in this day and age, we're constantly connected. We can't put the phone down. We can't take a break. I actually challenge you to use time limits on your social media apps and how much you are on your phone. You will be astounded to see how many hours per day you are spending on social media and not on your schoolwork or anything else that's important in your life. People, we have 24 hours in a day. I wish we had more, believe me. But if you want to know where your time is going, set limits on it and you'll be appalled. I have a teenage daughter, and I couldn't believe when I saw that she was spending 8 hours a day on social media. That's a full work day, okay? Need I say more? All right. So, how do you limit social media interruptions? Number 1, don't reach for a device every time you have a free moment. Put it down. Have a conversation face to face. You don't have to take a picture of everything. You don't have to snap everything. You don't have to keep updating your story. Enjoy what's in front of you. Stop to smell the roses. Create device-free zones. This is very important. I don't know how many of you have noticed families and couples out to dinner and they're all on their phones. No one is having a conversation. It is extremely sad. So I know that in our family, we are not allowed to have cell phones at our dinner table or during meal times, because truly it is one of the very few times where our family is together for moments at a time, where we can share about our day and be present and be mindful. And, having messages or streaks with someone or texting with someone is great, but nothing replaces a face-to-face interaction. I know that can be challenging sometimes, but it's really refreshing to the soul to have a face-to-face visit with someone. So try and do it as much as you are able to. So now let's talk about gender and how that affects listening and responding. Men and women are very different, and we communicate differently, and we have different goals in our communication and in our listening. So I want to talk about that. The first is that women tend to disclose similar experiences, and we bond with other people if we have had a Me Too moment. It draws us closer to that person, and it endears us to them, and it builds that bond or connection with the other person. Now, men, however, tend to solve or distract. Now, ladies, if you've ever had a problem and you share it with your boyfriend, chances are he's probably trying to solve it for you or tell you how to fix it, when honestly, really, you just want him to listen, right? So again, we're very different creatures and we have different goals. Guys, sometimes women just want you to listen. We don't need you to fix it. We just need a vent. So just sit there and bear with us. All right. Empathy from a woman. So remember, we talked about perspective taking and putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Empathy from a woman can feel like a put down to a man. He could feel upset or have his feelings hurt because you're trying to share with him when he doesn't want that. So again, you have to understand the person that you're dealing with, because sometimes you're not communicating. You're speaking English, but you're not communicating in the same language. Also, a man's well-intentioned response can feel like a disinterest to a woman. Again, we just want people to listen. And that's why your girlfriends will always understand, right, ladies? But when you tell your guy friends or your boyfriend what the problem is, they don't understand why you're making such a big deal of it. All right? So keep that in mind. Gender has a big influence on communication, how people interact, how people listen, and just being aware really helps. I mean, you can't change inherently who people are, but you do need to understand them and meet them where they're at and know that the only person that you can change is yourself. So be aware that people communicate differently, they listen differently, and once you understand that, that awareness will help you in your communication. Now I want to talk about hurtful listening habits. We're all guilty of that. No one is a perfect listener because, as we know, it's hard work. It's super challenging to be mindful and to be aware and to be sincere and to have it all together and to fully be there, because let's face it, we have a lot on our plates. We have a lot on our minds. Life is complex and difficult at times, especially when you're going to college and you're working and you're balancing a social life and family and responsibilities. So let's talk about some of the hurtful listening habits and the types of listeners out there that aren't so great. So the first one are the pseudo listeners. And these people are pretending to listen. Sometimes I call them my students. So if this were a face-to-face lecture and I would see your smiling faces out there and I'm lecturing, many of you would just look at me and do this. The old smile and nod. The old, I'm going to just smile and nod so she thinks I'm listening, but I'm really not here. I'm on vacation in Tahiti right now. Yeah. All right. Tuning in and out. So selective listeners, I like to call these children. So for example, if I say to my kids, hey guys, if you clean up your room, I'll take you to Chick-fil-A. And what my kids are really hearing is, we're going to Chick-fil-A. So they didn't hear, got to clean up the room first, right? So that's a selective listener. A defensive listener, they perceive themselves as being attacked. Always. Okay. They're always on the defensive. No matter what you say, you're going to upset this person. I know you know people like this, right? You can't win for losing with them. So they're always upset about something and you're always hurting their feelings. Insulated listeners are avoiding the issue. They're pretending like it's not there. Okay. So we could talk about everything except that, right? So be careful of insulated listeners. Insensitive listeners ignore the underlying issue. So insensitive listeners take things at face value. They just don't, they're not cognitively complex. They don't think that there's another possible interpretation for the behavior. They take things at face value, and it's very, very dangerous. And then conversational narcissists. Maybe you know people like this. They're extremely self-centered. Everything is about them. So enough about me. Let's talk about me. Right? Do you know people like this? It's always about their life and their job and their dog and their boyfriend and yada, 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 right? It's exhausting when you deal with a conversational narcissist. So be careful with that. And then also just talking too much in general. Sometimes you should talk less and listen more, because you're really missing out when you talk too much, because there's so much that's being said that you're not hearing, because you're not listening to it. You're not being mindful and you're not being present and aware when you're in the conversation. So let's talk about 6 tips on how to listen non-defensively, because it's really hard to be non-defensive sometime when we're listening, especially when we're having a heated argument with someone, right? You're having it out with them, they're talking, and then this is all you hear. Pop, 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 pop. You're thinking, can you just get done so I can say what I want to say, because I'm about to zing you, right? Try and remove yourself from that. Try and really focus on the clues and the cues of what's being said, because communication is complex. All right, so the first thing on how to listen non-defensively is to remember your good qualities, because you do have them, all right? Avoid negative self-talk. Positive self-talk is so important. You need to lift yourself up, you need to build yourself up, and you need to believe in yourself. Even though you might be having a bad day, tomorrow will be a better day. I promise you it will. Stop expecting perfection from you and from others, okay? Nobody's perfect, all right? Give people some slack. Give yourself some slack. Thank the person for sharing, especially if it's something that's difficult. Self-disclosure, which we're going to be talking about shortly, is not easy for people. And so when they're sharing something with you, especially something personal, thank them for that. Ask questions. This is the key to everything, guys. I cannot emphasize this enough. Ask questions, but more importantly, ask the right questions. Sometimes what we're missing is because we're not asking the right questions, so the person's not divulging that. All right, sometimes ignorance is bliss, right? But sometimes you need to know, and you need to ask those tough questions to get the answers that you need. And then finally, learn and move on from the situation. The more you learn, the more you grow, and the more you know for the next encounter that you have. That's what's amazing about communication. You're always learning, you're always growing, and there's always an opportunity to apply what you learned to a future communication situation. Now, I want to talk about what we use listening for. I mean, it's obvious we use it at school, and it's obvious that it's one of the most important skills and tools that you use as a student. But there are different types of listening, and there are different purposes for listening. So the first type of listening is relational listening, and that is to emotionally connect with others. And that's really important because communication is about connectivity. It's about connecting. It's about building relationships. So keep that in mind. Another type of listening is supportive, and that's to help the speaker deal with personal dilemmas. I'm sure you've listened to your friends with their romantic problems or their problems with their boss or problems with their family. People sometimes just need someone to listen to them and be supportive. So be that person that someone can count on for that. Task-oriented listening is listening in order to secure the proper information to get the job done. If any of you have ever trained someone at your job, you realize how actually difficult your job is when you have to explain it to someone else, right? Something that you do with your eyes closed suddenly becomes very complex when you're explaining to someone else how they are to replicate it. So it's very important that listening for a task-oriented focus, that you're really honing in. Analytical listening is to fully comprehend a message from a variety of perspectives. So analytical listening is super important, especially when you're listening to a persuasive message. And then finally, listening for critical understanding. This goes beyond understanding to assess the quality of the message. So assessing the evidence and the reasoning and the speaker's credibility. These are all very important attributes to listening. Just because a speaker is giving a message, what do you think about the speaker? Because if you don't have credibility and you don't feel that that speaker is trustworthy, you're not going to listen to what they have to say. So listening is a lot more complex. And then listening to comprehend, listening for retention. That is what you do as a student. I would truly hope that you don't listen in order to regurgitate something back on a test so you can pass it. The true key to listening is listening to comprehend and to understand and to be able to apply it. And I promise you this, listening is hard work, but the more time and effort you put into it, the better listener that you'll become. So let's end today's lecture on talking about 4 tips on how to listen more mindfully. So how do you do that? So listening mindfully is being fully present with others. In order to do that, you need to put your phone down. You need to put all distractions away, and you need to focus on who is in front of you. You want to pay close attention to their mannerisms, their gestures, their silences, what they say, how they say it, all of it, and be committed to understanding the perspective of the other person without being judgmental or defensive. Easier said than done. But listening mindfully is being present. and really giving that person that respect, because I think we can all agree that it's very hurtful when someone's not listening to us. When you're trying to share something with someone and they're too busy snapping someone or tweeting someone or checking a status or just not paying attention and not looking at you. So remember how that feels and try and reverse that and be positive and be the listener that you want others to be. All right, so these 4 tips for listening mindfully. Number 1, determine when to be mindful. It's not important to be mindful if you're listening to music while you're cleaning the house, right? You don't have to listen intently. But when you're listening to your professor's communication lecture, that's a time to be mindful. All right, commit to fully being present. It's a commitment. It's easier said than done. And believe me, it's difficult. But once you start applying yourself and doing it, it'll be like riding a bike. It'll be super easy. All right, acknowledge your feelings. It's not easy to do. Listening is hard work. Remember, I told you, it's something that takes time. It takes effort, but the payoff is huge. And finally, be patient. Know that no one becomes a great listener overnight. Anything that you do requires work, requires time, requires effort. But again, the payoff is huge. And I am going to leave you with one tool. We talked about perception checking in Chapter 2, and that's an excellent tool to add to your toolbox to minimize misunderstanding and miscommunication. I want to talk about paraphrasing. So this is another thing that you can do when you're not quite sure what someone meant. So paraphrasing essentially is putting in your own words what you thought the speaker meant. So it's not repeating back word for word what they said. It's translating what they said into different words and then asking for clarification if that is indeed what they meant. Try it, because believe me, it works. And so many misunderstandings could be prevented just by listening more. So, on your journey to becoming a better listener, I salute you, I support you, and I hope this lecture has been helpful for you in understanding just how critical listening is to you as a college student. Thank you for listening.